All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to this workshop. I can see people are kind of trickling in a little bit. Um, so thanks for coming to this session. My name's Rachel Figueiredo. I'm Waterloo's entrepreneurship librarian, and I'm going to spend the next 45, 50 minutes giving the first of three workshops for this workshop series from idea to impact. So this one is called Finding Gaps in Your Problem Space. And I really wanted to use this as a starting point for the workshop series because I've been the entrepreneurship librarian at Waterloo for almost 12 years. And I feel like over time, when I've talked to so many student entrepreneurs, there are lots of questions that we have about how to actually do the research to become good entrepreneurs or to, learn about a specific new subject area. But then there's also learning how to be an entrepreneur and sort of understanding, if we sort of take a step back, there's sort of understanding the problem space that we're working in, understanding more broadly, what's happening in that space, so that you're starting off your sort of problem discovery with a really strong footing. So that's why this workshop is sort of kicking off the entire workshop series. What I'm going to do today is probably do most of the talking, frankly. This workshop series is designed to be online so that I can share the recording with others afterwards as well, recognizing that, timing can be tough. And I know every one of you is so busy. So I wanted to be able to make sure that you could join me in real time if that's helpful for you. And then you can have the recording afterwards if you want to refer back to things. I will have a couple of interactions throughout the workshop, so I'm so glad that you're all here to help me along the way. What we're going to do for the workshop is sort of talk about understanding your problem space. And I'm going to use a framework in particular called the Impact Gaps Canvas. I'm going to use that as one framework, one sort of suggested framework to help you understand how to make connections in your entrepreneurial research. We're also going to use some of our library information research tools, and I'm going to talk about a database called Scopus in particular today. And then lastly, we're going to talk about how to maybe integrate some of the research tools that I'm sure you're already using and you're familiar with, but maybe prompting them and thinking in a different way to find non-traditional resources, things from NGOs or think tanks, governments, that kind of thing. So we're kind of going to go all over the place today, but I would really say this is like a great starting point. If you are an entrepreneur, or I guess even more broadly than that, if you're someone who's doing research in a new research area or someone sort of with a big idea and you want to try to uncover how to do research in that new field of yours. So despite the fact that I am the entrepreneurship librarian, I think a lot of the skills that we'll talk about today are really transferable to different research areas, and they don't have to be necessarily for you to be starting a business, creating a startup. It could have broader applications than that. For every one of the workshops that I do to a class or to, a general audience, I usually like to have one central example. And so for today, we're going to focus on how do doctors or healthcare providers and patients communicate outside of the office. So that's going to be sort of the starting point or the starting idea. The reason that I like to have a general example is because I know everybody is probably interested in different research topics. So we could have like however many participants we have here. If we've got 9 people joining, we could be going off in 9 different directions. And so what I'd like to do is kind of create a centralized example so that I can give you my best suggestions for how to get started if you're doing this kind of research, doing research in like a new field. And then we'll sort of move forward from there. So as entrepreneurship librarian, part of my job is to give workshops like this. Part of it is to meet with students and faculty and staff one-on-one. So if you have follow-up questions, if I'm not touching on, the research field that's of interest to you or the resources I'm talking about don't really fit your needs, we can always have a follow-up appointment and talk about your specific questions instead, okay? So let's start by thinking about how you get started researching in a new area. All of you are probably from different disciplinary backgrounds. You all are probably experts or, gaining expertise in those research fields. So if you're a science student, I trust you know how to find science information. If you are an art student, I trust that you know how to find information that you need for your classes in the arts. But then what happens when you might start, thinking about a topic outside of your research area, especially if you're thinking about, starting a business or being an entrepreneur or problem solving and helping in some way, is that not only do you have to learn the topics of this new research field, but you also have to try to learn like how to be an entrepreneur, right? Like what are the mechanics of doing that? What are all the words that people are throwing in your face now around market research and industry research, and what does it mean, right? I think one of the most important things that you can do as you are emerging into a new research area is recognize that you are very unlikely to be the first person to think of this new research topic. So in our example of how do doctors communicate with patients outside of the office, if I were to think that I am the first person to ever consider, how are doctors and patients communicating, and maybe I start jumping to conclusions thinking about, I'm going to create some mobile app, or, I start doing a lot of really intensive research and doing interviews and talking to doctors and patients one-on-one to try to better understand the problem from that angle, I'm going to be spending a lot of my time, a lot of my resources with really intensive research, which is important if we're trying to understand a new research area, but is probably not the first step that I would recommend. When you are embarking on a new research area, I would recommend taking a step back and recognizing that the research field is new to you, but probably, or the solution that you might be thinking of might be sort of new to you and a new idea for you. But we want to consider who else may be involved in this conversation already, what solutions already exist. Basically, like, has your idea already been put out there? And you almost want to try to validate the fact that your idea doesn't exist first, right? What I'm showing you on the screen here is a resource from Map the System, which is a research-intensive competition. It's not developed at Waterloo, actually, but Waterloo members do participate. And again, it's not necessarily for entrepreneurs, it's for problem solvers and solutions-based thinkers. And so one of the reasons that I brought this resource into play is because as I was looking at the resources recommended from this particular research challenge, I really liked the way that they talked about doing research to understand your problem. They really take sort of like a systems thinking approach to it. So what you can see here is, if I kind of zoom into the research part of this, there are sort of two things that I wanted to point out. The first thing is that they talk about doing secondary research. So that would be finding research that exists somewhere else already, research that's already been published. And they give a number of different examples. So sometimes it could be academic content like articles or books or things. Sometimes it could be blogs. It could be organization websites. It could be social media content. But the point is that you're looking to find information that's already been published somewhere. And so it doesn't have to necessarily be like academic information, although we are going to talk about that a little bit today. But they talk about how secondary research, this research that's already been published, really ties into primary research. And so that's the kind of information that I was talking about before. Usually our student entrepreneurs will sort of jump to primary research when they're doing their problem solving, because they think, okay, I have to go understand this problem, so I have to go talk to people who are affected by the problem. That makes a lot of sense. But again, you can see how talking to people, doing these one-on-one interviews, or even if you conduct a survey or do focus groups, could be really time intensive. And so what this is sort of recommending is that you would start with secondary research, find all the information that we can that's already been published on your topic so that you have a really strong footing in that subject area. And then from there, you could move into primary research. And these questions along the way, like, you can't find your answer, in an online or in a book. Basically, it's saying like do the research to find the information as best as you can that's already been published, so that when you get to the primary research phase, you're asking really good questions. You're asking questions that you can't find the answers to elsewhere. So you're saving yourself time, but you're also saving and making the best use of, the interviewee's time as well. The other reason that I'm pointing this out as sort of just starting to think about how we get into research is the fact that this is a cycle. They present it as like a big circle. You're doing your research and it's not linear, which I do think a lot of people think of when they're trying to do their research. Is sometimes we kind of cap ourselves or think about, okay, I'm going to do my research and then I'm going to like check that off my to-do list and then I'm going to be done. When realistically, doing research in a field that you really want to like try to better understand, you want to do this problem solving in, and maybe even come up with a new solution for, probably requires you to go through this cycle a couple of times, or even go through sort of mini cycles of like, I'm doing secondary research, I'm looking at, academic content, and now I have to go look at organizational websites, and now I have to go look over here. And I want to point that out because I want to make it really clear that it's not a failing on your part if research is really time consuming. It just is really time consuming. And I want to hopefully show you some ways where you can kind of point you in the right direction, fast track you a little bit so that you're not wandering around looking for information in places where you're not going to find good quality answers. So I guess if I had to sum it up, that's kind of what the focus of this is today. So I mentioned that I do want to have a couple chances to interact with you guys. And I've got, I think, 2 chat storms throughout this session. So if you haven't done a chat storm before, the idea is that I'm going to ask you a question, and then I want you to use the chat within Zoom. On your screen, it should just be down toward the bottom. You should see it between the participants section and the React section here. So you can open up the chat. You can start typing in your answer, but please wait until I say, okay, go. And then you guys can actually submit your answers to me so that we can all have a little chance to sort of think about our answers and have that time to type. And then we can all see each other's responses at the same time. So here's the question. I'm curious to learn from you what systems, frameworks, or tools you use to stay organized during your research projects. So again, take a moment to take this question in and think a little bit about what tools do you use, what systems might you use? If you are trying to do research in a subject area, how do you stay organized? So I'll let you open up the chat and you can go ahead and start typing in your questions, your answers. And in a second, I will ask you to click go. Hold on, wait. All right, go ahead. You can put your answers in. So I see a couple of responses came through already. OneNote, Zotero, Excel, Drive, Notebook LM. I am not familiar with that one, but I'm going to look into it. Mostly use Notes and Google Docs. Yeah, these are great. Mind map, citation managers, Zotero, Obsidian, Notebook LM. Okay, I'm loving seeing these responses. And I hope they're kind of useful for you guys as well. I think one of the benefits of some of these sessions is that we can learn from each other a little bit about like, where do you go? What tools might you be missing out on? I know Zotero for sure, and someone else mentioned just citation managers. Those are really helpful. They can help you to generate citations or references if you're trying to write research papers. And oftentimes you can kind of write notes or stay organized that way. To be honest, sometimes I just use like Google Drive, or we're a Microsoft campus, so I tend to use folders and stuff within there and just kind of have nested folders. I think this is really helpful to think about the mechanics of how we stay organized during a research project. And what I want to jump into is talking to you about the frameworks of thinking that we might use as we try to organize our research, like the larger topic of like, how am I going to get into this research question in our heads? So you can think about your organizational systems as I talk through this next thing, this next piece of the puzzle here. Again, this isn't really a tool to use in terms of organizing your research findings, but more of a framework of thinking, and you could integrate it into some of those research or organizational tools. So the framework that I want to talk about today is called the Impact Gaps Canvas. I'm introducing this during the first workshop of the series, but there are other different frameworks that you could make use of as well. One of the topics that I mentioned already, or one of the tools that I mentioned, is from Map the System. If you're familiar with the problem pitch competition that happens on our campus, there's a problem lab methodology. These are all different ways to start sort of like prompting you as the researcher to ask good questions or think about how you're going to get into a new research field. And so they're all a little bit different, and yet they all kind of have the same theme to them. So I'm presenting Impact Gaps Canvas today because it's one that I've really come to like, but I will also show you where I'm sort of pointing to some other frameworks or tools that you might make use of later on in the workshop. So Impact Gaps Canvas was created from the field of social entrepreneurship, but it's really broadly applicable, and it doesn't have to be for social entrepreneurs. It doesn't have to be even for entrepreneurs. It could just be for anyone who's trying to understand, why does a problem still persist? If there's a problem out there and there are solutions already to that problem, then like, why is this problem still in place? So if you take a look on the left-hand side of the page here, what you would start if you're trying to do like some impact gaps and engage with this framework, what you would do is start with the challenge mapping section, this left-hand column here, and walk through these guiding questions. Here's where it asks you, like, how do you describe the challenge? What is the impact of the challenge? What's the cause of the challenge? And what is the history and future of the challenge? You can see why something like this can be really helpful, because it's trying to get you away from, just the first searches that we usually do are popping up on like, just what's the most recent thing, or what are the things that are happening that are sort of the, most popular or most broadly applicable things. But if you really want to try to understand a challenge, you might start considering not just what's happening around that challenge or that problem right now, but what has kept this in place historically, or where did this sort of problem start? When did we start trying to come up with solutions for this particular problem? And so these are sort of guiding questions to help you think about, how am I going to research into this topic? How am I going to try to make sense of this particular thing? So to engage with the Impact Gaps Canvas, first you would start trying to answer the questions down this side of the page here, the guiding questions, and then you would hop over to the solutions mapping side. So it has very similar questions over here, but instead of thinking just about the challenge that's in place or just about the particular problem, so in our case, if we're trying to think about how do doctors and patients communicate outside the office, the challenge here might be doctors don't have enough time, or their doctors' offices are sort of short-staffed. Patients aren't getting timely access to quality care. How do patients get access to information outside of typical like doctor's hours? And so we're starting to think from the challenge space. When we hop over to the solution section, it's asking us things like, what is happening locally? What is happening globally? What's working and what's not? Where is the focus and where's the future? And so here we might start doing some research into, how have doctors been communicating with patients outside of like a physical office space? And you might start thinking about, creating a mobile app or trying to research if examples of that exist. I can think of like telehealth examples that we have available in Ontario. So there are lots of different ways that you might start thinking about, okay, well, there are some solutions that exist for doctors and patients to communicate, but there's still sort of a challenge here, and patients and doctors maybe not making the best use of in-office time, or patients still not getting timely care or timely access to doctors. And so as you're walking through these questions, it's trying to sort of prompt you to research really broadly, but also to research in these maybe more specific questions to help you narrow down from your broad topic to like a more narrow research question, right? Because even the one that I'm suggesting today, this doctors and patients communicating example, is really quite broad. But as we start researching it, we might start coming up with more specifics that could be useful for us as we move into this impact gaps piece. So you work on the challenge mapping, you work on the solutions mapping. Those are really both research based, the guiding questions are really prompting you to do research here. And then the impacts piece in the middle is where this framework, I think, really shines, is that the idea is it's, again, prompting you with some guiding questions, but here's where you do your critical thinking to make connections between, what are the challenges, what are the solutions, and where are the gaps between those challenges and solutions? Who is not being served, or what's missing that might bridge that gap? What's missing in terms of specific regulations, knowledge sharing, partnerships? What are some ways where we might think either about a solution like, excuse me, a new business idea or a new app or a new product, but what are some other ways that we might think around this challenge to consider how else we could support the work that's already being done, maybe amplifying it in some way? And so the idea with the Impact Gaps Canvas, for me, sort of presenting it to you guys, is that it's a framework of thinking to help you start like cracking open that nut, right? While you were writing all of your notes about where you go to organize your research, this is the piece where I want to kind of connect the Impact Gaps Canvas to the places that you're already using or the tools that you already have in place. There are lots of different ways that you could actually engage in this kind of work and kind of keep track of your progress throughout. So, I mean, some people, if they like to work physically with like sticky notes and stuff, you could just print this out and then write your notes and have sticky notes on there to kind of keep track of your progress. I'm going to do a little version of that through the slides today. But if you are the sort of person who's using Zotero or Excel, then maybe you have a folder in Zotero for your challenge mapping and then for your solutions mapping. And so you kind of start organizing the research findings in that way. Or even through Excel, you could have sort of different tabs where you're organizing the findings that you have and taking notes along the way. And I think that note-taking piece is really important as researchers as well, that we are doing some critical thinking in between all the reading and the intaking information, that you're considering like, okay, how do I make sense of this? And then what's next? All right. So we've talked a little bit about where you're going to go. Oh, and thank you, Amy. Amy has just put the link to the Impact Gaps Canvas in the chat. So in case you wanted to link from there, I will share the slides and the recording after the workshop, so you'll have access to them that way as well. So we're going to move into actually doing some research and sort of searching on a topic together. But before we do, I'd really like to hear from you to better understand where you go to do your research. So we're going to do one more chat storm. Again, I'm going to ask you a question. You can start typing and just hold your answers. And then when I say go, you can put all of your answers into the chat at the same time. So our question is, what tools, databases, or websites do you use for your research projects? If you are trying to actually find information on a topic, where do you go? There's no wrong answers. I'm not a judgy librarian, I promise. So you can put what you actually use in the chat. And again, this is a great chance for us to sort of share experiences. So you can start typing, but just hold your responses. Okay, you can click enter. Okay. Got Scopus, Web of Science, Research Rabbit, SciSpace, Google Scholar, Perplexity, sometimes Wikipedia. Yep, academic databases like PubMed, Google, ChatGPT. Excellent. Yeah. Google Scholar, the library. This is great, you guys. I think I'm seeing some discipline-specific examples. PubMed is definitely a tool used heavily by our health sciences students. And then sometimes we've got some more broad research tools that we're using. And that can be a really good starting point for research into a new field as well. If you're kind of not sure where to go, I'm actually going to recommend Scopus today. That's going to be sort of the broad research tool. So I'm happy that a couple of people are familiar with that already. But I think we'll have time for me to showcase maybe two different tools. I'm going to pause on this page in case you guys wanted to scan the QR code and follow along as I'm doing some searching. Again, there's no need. You will also get access to the recording afterwards as well. So it's really just how you like to learn. If you prefer to kind of do the searching side by side, that's just fine. The QR code is going to lead you to my entrepreneurship, innovation, and commercialization guide. And I am going to hop over there now so that I can do some sort of real-time search examples for you. So this research guide, I've recently started calling it a research companion. I feel like that might be a more accurate way to describe it. So if you're doing research, and a lot of you, if you're interested in entrepreneurship, might already be involved in one of our programs on campus, whether it's at the Conrad School or in one of your classes, if you're in like a Plus Business program, or maybe you're doing work for Velocity in something like Cornerstone, or you're working over at Greenhouse. There are lots of different programs that our students get involved in. And then those programs might start asking you to do research in some way. They might even not necessarily ask it outright. They might not say like, hey, you have to do research, but they might start asking pointed questions about your topic. And you're like, okay, I probably have to find some stats to back up what I'm talking about. Or maybe they do ask you to do industry research or market research. And so when you get to that point, if you're kind of trying to figure out where do I go to answer my research questions, this is really what this guide is for. I actually think maybe more broadly than that, it can also be used in the way that I've kind of been talking to you guys today as getting to know a new subject area and learning about a new subject. So if you are new to the field of entrepreneurship, it can also help you in that way as well. So I'll show you what I mean. If we are on, I'm going to jump over to the research tab here. And you can see that there were some nested tabs there for industry research, company research, etc. When we're on each one of these tabs, it's going to talk a little bit about like, what are we doing here? When people tell you to do research as an entrepreneur, what exactly are we looking for? And how are we going to find out sort of what the parameters of the ask are, right? So if someone asks you to do industry research, or you discover that you need to do some industry research, this tab will talk to you a little bit about like what kinds of questions might you be asked to answer when you're doing industry research. I usually include some resources. So in this case, I've got from an online course that's freely available. It talks to you about understanding like how to do industry research if this is new to you. And then we also include library resources, and I'll go into a couple library resources for our search example today. So for each one, I'm trying to pinpoint like if you're doing industry research, here are some tools where we actually have industry reports. The other thing that you'll notice throughout the guide are these little icons. So for all of the library resources, I've tried to tag them with this little golden book icon. We pay to have subscriptions to these resources every year, and we're only able to grant that access to active students, staff, and faculty at Waterloo. But I do recognize that at some point, people typically age out of our system and you graduate and you still are looking for good quality sources of information. So the other thing you'll see are these little blue globe icons throughout the guide. And those ones are linking to resources that are freely available, that you don't have to be a member of University of Waterloo to use. So you can access those at any point in time. Okay, so I've been hopping over a little bit. I want to land on this tab for ideation. So I'm going to go to this tab, Research for Ideation and Inspiration. Ideation to me is the phase that we've been talking about. It's the I have a really good idea, I think phase. It's the like, oh, I have an idea and I want to do more research in this field to know if it's a good idea phase. And so on the ideation tab, again, there's some information, some resources that I could link you to help you better understand this topic. And if we click over there, you'll actually see the Impact Apps Canvas pop up, as well as a couple of the other systems or frameworks that I've talked about already. So if I've been talking about the Impact Apps Canvas and that one's not resonating for you, there are other tools or frameworks that I might recommend to help you start sort of understanding how to understand a problem. That's really what these tools are for. But if we scroll over to this tab, Research for Ideation and Inspiration, here's where I'm actually pointing to the resources that I recommend to students most often to do that kind of work, to find the answers for their questions. So in the ideation phase, I typically recommend some broader research tools. So some of the ones that you guys have mentioned in the chat today are excellent examples. And I'm going to go into first a tool called Scopus to showcase what that tool can do. Scopus is an academic research tool. It's used to find things like journal articles and academic book chapters. And it would be very similar to, if you guys are used to using something like Google Scholar, it's a very similar intent, right? So you're going on Google Scholar rather than just going to Google because you're searching for academic content. And so that's sort of the same idea here. But if you're not used to using Scopus, I want to showcase why I like using it, because I do think that it maybe has some better ways to interact with the results that you get from this tool once you're on the results page. So you can see I've actually typed in the search here. I'm going to do it again. How do doctors communicate with patients outside the office? If I was new to searching in this field and I am used to searching in Perplexity or ChatGPT or Copilot or Google Scholar, this is probably how I would start my search, which makes a lot of sense because all of those tools are really good at natural language prediction. So I can type in the word doctor and it's going to understand that I mean doctor or healthcare practitioner or physician. I can type in these phrases like outside the office, and it's going to do its best to understand what I mean by that. This is one sort of failing of using Scopus, and honestly, this is probably the biggest learning curve for most of our students, is that when you're coming to search in one of these academic research tools, these library research tools, you do have to spend more time thinking about how to, mix and match your keywords and how to create a search that's not like a full sentence, but just some keywords that we are piecing together. So I'm going to start off with doctor, and then I'm going to add a search field here. And you can see that what it's doing is telling me it's searching within the article title, the article abstract, and then any keywords that are assigned to that particular article. So it's going to search the word doctor in those different fields. And it's going to do the same thing with my next keyword. So if I type in the word patient, it's going to do the same thing there. And then I might go to some of those examples that we talked about for solutions. So if I wanted to specifically understand what are the solutions that might be in place, I talked to you guys before about potentially mobile apps. Potentially I can think about like telehealth or some examples that have existed in the past. They still exist today. I should correct myself, but I I want to get sort of a broad perspective on what solutions have been in place. So I'm breaking up my keywords just to create a little more specificity for the tool, and we'll see how it responds to that. So it does have 1,800 plus results. So it does have information on my topic. It just didn't understand the way that I was typing in my keywords the first time around. So it does, again, take a little bit of time to sort of restructure your search a little bit. And this is the sort of thing that a librarian can help with. This is also the sort of thing that an AI tool could help with. This type of searching is called Boolean searching, where we're using ands and ors to connect our keywords. So if you did want to run a search, you might do like going to ChatGPT, going to Copilot, whatever tool you like to use, give it some parameters around your topic and ask it to come up with a simple Boolean search for your topic. So if the searching part feels tricky, that's another way you could kind of get into this. But I think the real magic of this is when we're on the results page in something like Scopus. So if we're on the results page here, you can see that there's a number of different ways that I can kind of interact with my research results. So I've got at the top, it's sorting my results by the date newest, which is fine. If I want to see the most recent results, that's how most of our search tools would interact with us, right? They're trying to show us the newest content first. But I might want to resort by relevance, or you could even resort by the number of times something was cited. And that's almost an indication of like popularity, for instance, right? Or impact. And so here we've got a review about the state of telehealth that's been cited 930 times. That means at least 930 other research papers have talked about this particular article. So it might be good for me just to understand what's written there and try to get a sense for that content. The other thing I notice when I take a look at, some of the articles that are popping up here, they are tagged by the type of article that they are. And some of the articles here are listed as review articles. Review articles are basically articles that are reviewing other research that's been conducted and then sort of presenting a summary of the research on that topic at a particular time. So this is a really good example. This one, the state of telehealth. That was published in 2016. So they're talking about telehealth and giving us sort of like a snapshot in time. Amy, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, there's just a question in the chat. Why would you choose to separate keywords instead of adding doctor and patient in the first line?
That is a really good question. So why did I do doctor and then create another search field instead of doing doctor and patient? There's no rhyme or reason. Like you could do it either way. And you could write all of this in one line. The entire search that I've just done, we could do all in one line. However, if you wanted to get more complicated with your search, if you wanted to do doctor or physician, I can't type right now, or healthcare practitioner, and you wanted to keep expanding your search with different synonyms for each one of these keywords, that might be a benefit to kind of separating out the different search fields. So that's usually why I would do that. And then what you can see here is that I've typed in some of the ors myself and relied on this database to include those ands throughout. So in the end, it's still kind of creating the same search, whether you do it all in one line or whether you separate it out. It's maybe just visually to help you see the search fields a little more clearly, depending on how complex you wanted that part to be. That's a good question. I'm going to leave this just for now at doctor. We were just talking about review articles, so I want to come back to that. So review articles can be really beneficial to be able to get that sort of snapshot in time or sort of a summary of different a new topic to you. So if that's of interest, if you're sort of looking at a new research field, you can actually limit to just review articles within Scopus. So you can kind of look at more of these summary articles. The other thing I like to play with here is the date range. So if you recall back to the Impact Gaps Canvas, one of the things that it was asking us to do was think about, well, what are current solutions, but also what are historical solutions? And so this can be really helpful. If you sort of hover over the date range, it's showing me information from the year 2000. Okay, the information from the year 2000 is probably going to be really different in terms of what solutions could have been put in place compared to the year 2025, just like technologically speaking. So you can shift around that date range if you wanted to go take a look at information from even just, 2000 to 2005. You can start to see a more historical perspective and kind of use this tool to help sort of shift where you're looking at on the timeline. And then the other thing I might mention here is the country territory section. We've really narrowed our results with all the things I've clicked already so far. But I wanted to point out again, if the work that you're doing, like again, if you're doing work for this Impact Gaps Canvas and it's asked you to think about local solutions and also global solutions, we might take a look here to see which countries are publishing information on this topic. So maybe Australia has some really good research that's been done on telehealth examples. So maybe we might hop over to look at that country rather than just thinking from our own perspective of what's happening in Ontario or what's happening in KW region. So I'm showing you Scopus because I think the results page is worth all the effort to do the searching part in the first place. Before I sort of move over from here, I want to show you how to actually get full text access, because through these library tools, you should not only be able to use them to search, but you should be able to access this content for free because we're already paying for it through the library. So with any of these articles, if you sort of look at the article title and think that's interesting to you, you might also take a look at the abstract just to fully understand if it still feels relevant to your research. And then click on the Get It at Waterloo button, where it will link you to our library catalog and show you where we would have access available online. So that's kind of the research process. I'm going to hop back over to this guide here, my entrepreneurship guide, because I'm showing you Scopus, but I've also got these other links here. And I think sometimes it's confusing, frankly, to be like, well, why? What are all these here for? And especially it's confusing when the information landscape that we're so used to, a lot of these tools like Google, like ChatGPT or any of our AI assistants, a lot of those tools aim to be sort of a one-stop shop for our research. So the aim for most of these is that you could kind of ask any question and sort of get any answer or access to any information. I say sort of because that's not entirely accurate. But I guess the reason I'm bringing it up is because with a lot of the library research tools, when you're looking in different databases, you're going to be looking for different types of information. So that's maybe a challenge, but also a benefit. So if we were looking in Scopus and we were primarily looking for journal articles or conference proceedings or book chapters across all disciplines, because it's a very interdisciplinary tool, we might open up one of these other research tools that are more focused on sort of business, economics, and they might include things like business magazines. They might include even newspapers. Factiva is really great if you want to search for news articles. And the only reason I'm not going to show it to you today is because it can take a little while to load for the specific example I was showing. But I will show you how we can use a very similar search in this one called Business Source Elite. So if we did doctor or patient or telehealth on a mobile app and search within this tool, it's going to find us different articles. You can see some of these are like news content, which is just a different perspective than the academic content. It can be a little easier to read for sure, but it's also giving us a different perspective on like the topic at hand, right? For the most part, I recognize that our entrepreneurs and problem solvers are not necessarily thinking about only looking in academic content, but the library has access to lots of other stuff beyond journal articles. So I wanted to point out that you can go to different research tools and be finding different sort of outputs. And so if you need any help with that, that's another sort of question that you could ask your librarian. Okay, I'm going to skip over a couple of these slides here. What I'll do is sort of land on this slide just to demonstrate how doing some research in Scopus, I would go back and interact with the Impact Gaps Canvas. So as I've been doing this search, I know today I was kind of wandering through Scopus and looking at a few journal articles. What I might do is actually take a look and start writing in. So at one point when I had done this search, one of the examples that popped up was around rural communities. And so more specifically than just sort of the challenge of doctors and patients communicating, it was focusing on a particular population. So that's an example of where I want to keep track of my research findings. A few of the slides that you'll have access to will demonstrate another example of this same research question. And so here, what I might do is go back and start editing my search. So if I discover a particular population of people that I want to focus on, or a particular area that I want to focus on, I would go back into Scopus and keep editing my search fields and keep being more specific. Because as you could see from our first search, there were lots of articles. And so we can keep being more specific and start narrowing down to the ones that are really, really relevant to us. So throughout these slides, I was able to find some information about a paper from Australia where they had particular particular examples of like a telehealth service that was being used in a rural community. So again, I might start engaging with this solutions mapping side of the page, giving myself sort of to-do lists and asks here. And so many of you using digital tools might think about how you could integrate some kind of notes throughout so that as you are reading research papers, you're kind of keeping track of what you found so far and where you need to go next. So thinking about what are sort of the broad questions that are going to keep you engaged. And I will say, I think this note-taking in particular can be really helpful when you are working in a space that you plan to be working in for a long time. If you're doing problem solving in this new area for you, but you're really excited about it and you think you're going to be working on this for a while, it can be really helpful when you've got these probably some gaps between these research sessions or gaps of time where, you've got midterms and you can't focus on this project right now. When you come back to it 2 weeks later, if you've written yourself some helpful notes about like, hey, your next step was to do this, that can be a really helpful prompt so that you don't have to, kind of re-engage from the beginning. Okay. We've got a few more minutes left, and I promised that I would talk about how to use some tools that I'm sure you're already using, but maybe thinking about using them in a different way to support this ideation research. So I went into Copilot, and I will say from Waterloo's perspective, Copilot is the tool that they recommend. It's the one that we do have a Waterloo subscription to. So there is a version of Copilot that is part of our Waterloo access. So that is the tool that they recommend. I know that you guys will also use whatever other tools you find to be helpful as well. So you could do similar things with ChatGPT for sure, and probably other AI tools as well. I've been collecting tips across the entrepreneurship ecosystem from other people in this space. And so some of these tips are not necessarily from me, but from people who are also helping our student entrepreneurs to think about how to integrate these tools into their work. So one of the suggestions was using it to get outside of your own headspace to think about who would be potential stakeholders for my idea. So again, I'm focusing on that doctor-patient communication piece. And so of course it prompts me to think about healthcare providers and patients, but it's also talking about like patient advocacy groups and regulatory bodies and all these things that maybe didn't come top of mind for me. So it's a way to start thinking about not only who could be potential customers or who else might be interested in my topic, but also thinking about who else might be publishing information on my topic. I see a comment in the chat about what are the benefits of using Copilot version versus the regular free version. And I do think there are probably different limitations to the Copilot version that we have available through the university, like in terms of how the data could be shared or stored through that system. So I think that's probably the university's major concern. They do have a website that I can share when I share all of the resources to this session afterwards about AI tools that are sort of allowable or permissible at the university. And some of it is the considerations of like, what is actually, thanks, Amy, what is actually like subscribed to. So they're providing some free access. And then also what is permissible within those tools in terms of like Waterloo data. So there might be some considerations there. Okay. If we were to keep going with this, one of the other prompts I might have is like, what are some of the regulatory bodies within Canada to cover this topic? And you'll notice that I'm not asking it for the actual information. I'm not asking it questions about, what does the CMA Association have in place for telehealth or doctor-patient communication? But I'm using this as a jumping off point. And then I'm going to go to those websites and actually do the research myself. Okay. And one of the other things that I would recommend is taking a look at think tanks in your particular area. So in this case, my particular area would have to be a little broader around, health research or patient advocacy in Canada. But think tanks are independent research-based organizations that do often publish really fantastic white papers and content that's still really well researched, but it's different than looking at an academic journal article, and often talks a little bit more about sort of the applications or what's happening in the real world. And so I think they're also a really good source of information that you might want to start thinking about searching around. I think I've got 2 more slides here to talk about, in this case, how might we do some creative searching within Google or Bing, whatever your search interface of choice is. But if you wanted to do some searching, in some of the examples that I was just giving, they're probably going to lead you to things like government websites that can be a little bit tricky to navigate, even some things like these think tank websites that I'm recommending. And so some of this might be refresher information for you guys, but I do often forget that there are ways that you can sort of search within a particular website. So in this case, the first example here where I'm doing a site.gov search, I'm looking for websites that end in .gov, but have this example of patient portal. Or I could switch my example to telehealth or mobile app or doctors, but using that as a way to search specifically for information coming from government websites, rather than having to wander the Government of Canada website or looking at US sites and trying to mind my way through. The other example I'm giving here is that you can give it a specific URL. So if I wanted to search, in this case for Statistics Canada, and find information on patient portals that might have been published by them, you can also do a URL search to sort of fast track your way into some of these sites that are really content dense. They have a lot of information, but they're also just like really dense to try to get into. Okay. The last example I have is that you can also do this with file types if you were trying to search for PDFs in this case. There's nothing specific about file type PDF that would make that a more credible source. PDFs aren't more credible innately than any other information. It's more just thinking about who might publish a PDF online. And in that case, in this case here, it's from an Ontario Health organization. So probably it's more organizations, regulatory bodies, government websites. And so again, it's just sort of worthwhile to try some of these other searches for your topics. When Google or a search engine is often our starting point, it's sort of like, how do we search in different ways that we can kind of connect with that tool to really good quality information as fast as possible? Okay. If we go back to our impact gaps canvas, I might start taking a look at How am I going to sort of map my challenges, map the solutions that exist, and then prompt myself to think about how am I going to engage with this particular topic and start thinking about the gaps that remain and, why they're still in place based on all this really good quality information that I already have. I would say this is the starting point if you are in this ideation phase, if you're new to a research topic. Using a framework of any kind, whether the Impact Gap Canvas or one of the other ones that's on the website, using a framework that could help you start thinking around that topic and prompting you to think of different research questions for that topic is a really good way to get into it. So today, we talked about the Impact Gaps Canvas. I used Scopus and Business Source Elite to do some research on this topic. And then in the end, we talked a little bit about using some resources that you probably already know how to use to find non-traditional resources of information like content from NGOs, think tanks, the government, etc. In the slide deck, there are links to all of the resources that I've touched on today, and you'll also note there are some tutorials if you wanted to better understand that Boolean searching that I was doing. You'll also have access to my contact information. So if you do want to follow up with an email or have an appointment, I would be really happy to meet with you to talk about your specific example, because I recognize today's had to be a little bit broad. And then very lastly, there are two things that I wanted to talk about. One is that today, Map the System, which is that research-based competition I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, they're starting their winter term sort of kickoff event with a matchmaking event. It's happening today from 4 to 6 p.m. in the community education room at Conrad Grable. So feel free to attend that if you're interested in Map the System. There is some information about it in the Daily Bulletin today as well. And then the next workshop in this series is happening next Tuesday. That one we are going to get into understanding markets and consumers, and we were going to understand how to get into Statista and Statistics Canada primarily. So if this is of interest to you, I hope you'll join me next week. It will be more about that market research piece and the customer discovery. So the slide is there. I saw a quick question if you'll have access to the recording. The answer is yes, and you will have access to the slides as well. Amy, you can go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you.